Mom, I need to tell you something before you hear it from someone else. My son's voice was different that Tuesday morning. Tighter. Like he was reading from a script he'd memorized but didn't want to speak aloud. I was standing in my kitchen, coffee mug in hand. The morning sun streaming through the window I'd cleaned just the day before. I wasn't prepared for what came next. Nothing could have prepared me. My coworkers think you're racist and homophobic, he said flatly. The mug slipped from my fingers and shattered against the tile floor. Coffee spread across the white ceramic pieces like blood. I stared at the mess, unable to move, unable to process what my ears had just heard. My son, my own son, had told his coworkers that I was a racist and homophobic woman. Me, the woman who'd marched for civil rights in 1968, the woman who'd held signs demanding equality, the woman who'd voted for every progressive candidate for 45 years, the woman who'd raised him to believe in justice. "Explain," I managed to say, my voice barely recognizable as my own. The line went quiet for a moment. I could hear the ambient noise of his office in the background, keyboards clicking, phones ringing, the dull hum of fluorescent lights. He worked in some tech company downtown, a job I'd never fully understood, but had always been proud of. My son, the successful one, the one who'd graduated from a good university, the one I'd bragged about to my friends. "You made a comment at Thanksgiving," he said, still using that stiff, formal tone, "about my friend Derek. You asked why he was bringing a date to the holiday gathering instead of his wife." I felt the room tilt slightly. Derek, his coworker, the one he'd mentioned in passing months ago. I'd made a comment. Yes, I remembered now. A casual observation. I'd said something like, "I didn't know Derek was married. Is his wife coming too?" It had been an innocent question, or so I'd thought. But even as I stood there, my mind rewound through that conversation, examining it from every angle, suddenly seeing it through a lens I hadn't considered before. Derek wasn't married. Derek had a husband. My comment had been ignorant, not malicious, but ignorance was still ignorance. And my son had taken that single moment and weaponized it into a character assassination at his workplace. "That was a misunderstanding," I said, but my voice sounded weak even to my own ears. "I didn't know." "You didn't ask," he interrupted. "You assumed, and when I corrected you, you seemed uncomfortable the rest of the night. Everyone noticed." Everyone. The word hung in the air between us like a physical thing. Not just Derek, not just my son. Everyone at that dinner table had apparently been analyzing my reaction, cataloging my discomfort, deciding that I was the villain in a story I hadn't known I was part of. I wanted to argue. I wanted to defend myself. I wanted to remind him of who I was, of what I'd done, of the principles I'd lived by for 62 years. But something stopped me. Something in his tone told me that defending myself would only make things worse. That he'd already made his decision about who I was, and no amount of explanation would change it. "I see," I said quietly. "Is there anything else?" "My boss asked me about my family values," he continued, and now there was something else in his voice. Not anger, but something colder. Disappointment, maybe, or disgust. He wanted to know if I came from a progressive household. I didn't know what to say. I felt like I had to distance myself from you to answer honestly. The words landed like physical blows. Distance myself from you, from me, his mother, the woman who'd given birth to him, the woman who'd raised him, the woman who'd spent every day of his life trying to teach him right from wrong, to be kind, to be fair, to see people as people and not categories. I understand, I heard myself say, though I didn't understand. Not really. Not yet. After we hung up, I stood in my kitchen for a long time, staring at the broken mug and the coffee stain on the tile. I didn't clean it up. I just stood there, my mind cycling through every interaction I'd had with my son over the past year. Every conversation, every family gathering, every moment where I might have said something that could be twisted into evidence of bigotry. The thing about accusations like that is that they don't need to be true to be devastating. They just need to be believed. And my son had made sure his coworkers believed them. He'd made sure his boss believed them. He'd made sure that I, his own mother, would spend the rest of my life wondering if maybe, just maybe, he was right. But he wasn't right, and I was going to prove it. I didn't call him back immediately. That was the first decision I made consciously, sitting at my kitchen table with my hands wrapped around a fresh cup of coffee. If I called back in anger, or tears, or desperate explanation, I would only confirm whatever narrative he'd constructed. I needed to think. I needed to understand exactly what he'd done, and why. The problem was that I knew exactly why. Or at least, I thought I did. My son, Marcus, had always been sensitive to criticism. Even as a child, if I corrected him about his homework, his manners, his attitude, he would withdraw into himself for days. His father, my ex-husband Robert, had called it being emotionally delicate. I'd called it being human. But as Marcus grew older, that sensitivity had hardened into something else. A defensiveness. A tendency to see slights where none were intended. A need to position himself as the moral superior in any situation. He'd been like that in high school too. Always the first to point out when someone said something problematic. Always the one to organize social justice campaigns and volunteer for causes. I'd been proud of him, initially. I'd thought he was carrying forward the work I'd started decades ago. But somewhere along the way, his activism had curdled into something that felt less like genuine belief and more like performance. Like he was using it to build an identity rather than to create real change. I'd mentioned this to my therapist once, years ago. She'd suggested that perhaps he was overcompensating for something. Perhaps he felt the need to prove his progressive credentials because he was insecure about something else. I'd dismissed the idea at the time. But now, sitting in my kitchen with the weight of his accusation pressing down on me, I wondered if she'd been right. The accusation itself was so small. One comment about Derek's marital status. One moment of ignorance that I'd been willing to learn from. But Marcus hadn't offered me that opportunity. He'd taken that moment and broadcast it. He'd weaponized my humanity, my capacity to not know everything, to make mistakes, to need to be educated, and turned it into proof that I was fundamentally a bad person. I spent that day making a list. Not a defensive list exactly, but a record. I wrote down every progressive cause I'd supported, every march I'd attended, every donation I'd made, every conversation I'd had with my son about equality and justice, and the importance of seeing people as people. I wrote down the names of his friends who'd come to my house over the years. Friends of all races, religions, sexual orientations, gender identities. I wrote down the conversations where I'd asked genuine questions about their lives and their experiences, trying to understand perspectives different from my own. By the time I finished, I had 7 pages. 7 pages of evidence that I was not the person my son had described to his coworkers. But I also knew that none of it would matter. That was the real horror of what he'd done. He'd created a version of me that was impervious to evidence. A version of me that was so fundamentally racist and homophobic that any attempt to prove otherwise would only look like denial or gaslighting. He'd positioned himself as the arbiter of truth, and he'd positioned me as the villain in a story I had no control over. I called him back on Wednesday evening. "I want to understand what you're saying," I began, keeping my voice level and calm. "Help me understand how one misunderstanding about Derek's marital status translates into me being racist and homophobic." "It's not just that one thing, Mom," he said, and I could hear the exhaustion in his voice, as if he'd been waiting for this conversation and dreading it at the same time. "It's a pattern. It's the way you ask questions, the assumptions you make, the way you sometimes seem uncomfortable around certain people." "I'm uncomfortable around people I don't know well," I said carefully. "That's not racism or homophobia. That's just being human. That's just needing time to adjust to new people in my life." "But that's exactly what I'm talking about," he said, and now there was frustration creeping into his voice. "You're making it about you. You're making it about how you feel, instead of considering how your discomfort might make other people feel." I opened my mouth to respond, then closed it. Because he was right about one thing, I was making it about me. But not in the way he meant. I was making it about my reputation, my character, my legacy, and he was making it about his need to distance himself from me, to prove to his coworkers and his boss that he was not like me, that he was better than me, that he understood things I would never understand. "Marcus," I said slowly, "I love you, but I think what you've done is unfair. I think you've taken one moment and blown it into something it's not. And I think you've done it because you needed to prove something to people at your job." "That's not true," he said, but his voice was uncertain now. "I'm just being honest about my family." "You're being selective," I corrected. "You're highlighting the things that make me look bad and ignoring everything else. That's not honesty. That's a narrative. And narratives can be just as false as outright lies." The line went quiet. I could hear him breathing on the other end, could sense him wrestling with something. Part of me hoped he was reconsidering. Part of me knew he wasn't. "I think we need some space," he finally said. "I think I need to focus on my own mental health and my own journey right now." Space. The new word for cutting someone out of your life. The new word for punishment that dressed up in therapeutic language. "How much space?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "I don't know yet," he said. "I'll let you know when I'm ready to talk again." And then he hung up. Just like that. 42 years of being his mother, and it ended with a dial tone. I didn't tell anyone at first. That was my mistake, I think. If I'd told someone immediately, a friend, a family member, a therapist, I might have been able to process it in a healthier way. But instead, I kept it to myself, which meant I spent the first week replaying every interaction I'd ever had with my son, searching for the moment I'd failed him. I found myself obsessing over small moments. The time I'd made a joke about his roommate's dreadlocks when he was in college. I'd meant it as a compliment. I'd said they looked cool, but maybe it had come across as fetishizing. The time I'd asked his girlfriend whether she'd ever considered straightening her natural hair because it would look nice. The time I'd expressed surprise that his friend was a doctor because she didn't look like a doctor, whatever that meant. These were moments I'd forgotten about immediately after they happened. Moments that had seemed insignificant at the time. But now, with Marcus's accusation hanging over my head, they became evidence. They became proof. They became the scaffolding upon which he'd built his case against me. I started reading articles about racism and homophobia, I started listening to podcasts about social justice. I started examining my own biases with a microscope, looking for the ways I might be perpetuating systems of oppression without even realizing it. And the more I read and listened and examined, the more convinced I became that maybe Marcus was right. Maybe I was one of those people. The well-meaning liberal who thought she was progressive but was actually complicit in systemic injustice. Maybe I was the problem. It was my friend Catherine who finally stopped me. Catherine and I had known each other for 53 years. We'd met in college, back when we were both idealistic and angry, and convinced that we could change the world. We'd marched together. We'd protested together. We'd raised our children in the same progressive bubble, believing we were modeling the values we wanted them to internalize. Catherine's daughter had turned out fine. She was a human rights lawyer who worked for a nonprofit. But Catherine had also seen her son go through a phase of performative activism in his 20s before he'd eventually found a more grounded version of progressivism. I'd finally called her on a Saturday morning, 2 weeks after Marcus's accusation, and told her everything. I'd expected sympathy. What I got instead was anger. "Stop it," she said flatly. "Stop doing this to yourself right now." "Doing what?" I asked, though I knew exactly what she meant. "This self-flagellation nonsense," she said. "This idea that you're fundamentally a bad person because your son decided to weaponize a moment of ignorance against you. Samili, listen to me. I've known you for more than half a century. I've watched you march for civil rights. I've watched you raise your children to believe in equality. I've watched you genuinely try to understand perspectives different from your own. And I've also watched you make mistakes, because that's what humans do. We make mistakes. We say things that are ignorant or insensitive or poorly thought out, and then we learn from them. But Marcus says," I started. "I don't care what Marcus says," Catherine interrupted. "What Marcus did was use your humanity against you. He took your capacity to learn and grow and turned it into evidence of your fundamental corruption. And you're letting him do it. You're accepting his narrative instead of standing in your own truth." I wanted to argue with her. I wanted to explain why she was wrong, why Marcus's concerns were valid, why I deserved to feel guilty. But something in her voice stopped me. Something in her absolute certainty about who I was. "You think I'm overreacting?" I said quietly. "I think you're underreacting to what your son actually did," Catherine said. "He publicly humiliated you to his coworkers. He positioned himself as morally superior to you. He created a narrative about you that has nothing to do with who you actually are. And then he cut you off without giving you a chance to respond or defend yourself or even understand what was happening. That's not justice, Samili. That's cruelty dressed up in the language of social consciousness." After we hung up, I sat with her words for a long time, and slowly, something shifted inside me. The shame I'd been carrying started to transform into something else. Anger, maybe, or clarity, or both. Marcus had done something to me. He'd taken my love for him and my desire to be a good person, and he'd weaponized them both. He'd created a version of me that was convenient for his narrative. He'd made me the villain in his story of moral awakening, and he'd done it without ever giving me the chance to have a conversation about it. That was the moment I decided I wasn't going to accept his narrative anymore. The first thing I did was reach out to Derek. I found him on LinkedIn. Marcus had mentioned his last name once or twice, and I sent him a careful message. I didn't accuse Marcus of anything. I didn't try to explain or defend myself. I simply said that I'd made an assumption about his marital status at Thanksgiving, and that I wanted to apologize for any discomfort that had caused. I said that I'd been ignorant about his relationship, and I was sorry for that ignorance. I said that I was interested in learning more about his life and his experiences, if he was open to that. He responded within an hour. He was kind. He said that he hadn't taken offense to my question. It had been an honest mistake, and he'd been happy to clarify. He said that he appreciated my willingness to apologize, and that he thought it was cool that Marcus's mom was so engaged with these issues. He said that if I ever wanted to grab coffee and talk, he'd be into that. I saved that message. I printed it out. I kept it in a folder on my desk. The second thing I did was reach out to Marcus's boss. I didn't do this in anger. I did it carefully, thoughtfully, with the full knowledge that it might blow up in my face. I found the company's website, identified the HR department, and sent a carefully worded email to the department head. I explained that my son worked there, and that I'd become aware that he'd been discussing my character with colleagues. I explained that I wanted to provide context for those discussions. I explained that I had spent my life working for social justice and equality, and that I'd recently become aware that my son had characterized me in a way that didn't align with my actual values and history. I attached a brief biography. I included links to the organizations I'd worked with. I included photos from marches I'd attended. I included testimonials from friends and colleagues about my commitment to progressive causes. It was aggressive. It was also necessary. The response came from the HR director herself, a woman named Victoria Chen. She said that she appreciated me reaching out, and that she wanted me to know that the company took these issues seriously. She said that they'd had a conversation with Marcus about the importance of not making broad generalizations about family members, and that they'd reminded him of the company's commitment to creating a workplace where people felt safe discussing their backgrounds without fear of judgment. She said that she hoped this situation could be resolved, and that she'd be happy to facilitate a conversation between me and Marcus if I thought that would be helpful. I didn't think it would be helpful. Not yet. But I appreciated that someone in a position of authority had taken my concerns seriously. The third thing I did was reach out to the other people who'd been at Thanksgiving. My sister, Eleanor, my brother David, my ex-husband Robert, my friends Catherine and Margaret. I called each of them individually and told them what had happened. I told them what Marcus had said, and I asked them if they'd witnessed anything that night that might have seemed racist or homophobic to them. The responses were unanimous. Eleanor said she'd thought I'd been gracious and welcoming to Derek. David said I'd asked thoughtful questions about his work and his life. Robert said he'd been impressed by how I'd handled meeting someone new to the family. Catherine and Margaret both said they'd seen nothing but kindness and genuine curiosity in my interactions. But the most important response came from Robert. He called me back after our initial conversation, and he said something that I needed to hear. "Samili, I want you to know that I've made a lot of mistakes in my life," he said. "I wasn't always a good husband. I wasn't always a good father. But one thing I know about you is that you've always tried to do the right thing. You've always tried to be better. And I think Marcus is at an age where he needs to see you as flawed in order to feel like he's superior to you. It's not fair, and it's not right, but it's what's happening." "Why would he do that?" I asked, though I thought I already knew the answer. "Because you're the only one of us who's been consistent about her values," Robert said. "You've never wavered. You've never compromised. And I think that makes him feel like he has to tear you down in order to prove that he's evolved beyond what you taught him. It's twisted, but it's human. It's what people do when they're trying to establish their own identity." After we hung up, I realized that Robert had given me the key to understanding what Marcus had done. He wasn't attacking me because I was actually racist or homophobic. He was attacking me because I represented something he needed to destroy in order to become who he wanted to be. I was the scaffolding, and he needed to tear me down to build something new in my place. But I wasn't going to let him do that. Not anymore. 3 weeks after Marcus cut off contact with me, I got a call from Victoria Chen, the HR director. "I want to give you a heads up about something," she said, and her voice was carefully neutral in a way that suggested she was about to tell me something significant. "Marcus has filed a formal complaint with our HR department. He's alleging that you've been contacting his colleagues and trying to manipulate the narrative about your character. He's also alleging that you've been interfering with his work environment and his ability to feel safe at his job." I felt my stomach drop. This was exactly what I'd been afraid of. By reaching out to Derek and HR, I'd given Marcus ammunition to use against me. I'd made myself look like the aggressor instead of the victim. "I see," I said carefully. "What does that mean for me?" "It means we're going to investigate," Victoria said. "We're going to look at what you sent to HR. We're going to talk to Derek. We're going to talk to Marcus. And we're going to determine whether your actions constitute harassment or interference. But I want to be transparent with you. Based on what I've read so far, I don't think what you did constitutes harassment. You sent one email to HR providing context about your background. That's not harassment, that's communication." "But Marcus is saying it is," I said. "Marcus is saying a lot of things," Victoria said, and now there was something in her voice that suggested she'd formed an opinion about my son that wasn't particularly favorable. "He's saying that your email was an attack on him. He's saying that you're trying to manipulate people into believing you're a good person. He's saying that your reaching out to Derek was an attempt to intimidate a witness. But here's what I know from my 20 years in HR. People who are actually victims of harassment don't usually have the energy to file formal complaints. They're usually too busy dealing with the trauma. People who file formal complaints are usually trying to regain control of a narrative that's slipping away from them." I didn't know what to say to that. Part of me wanted to argue with her, to point out that Marcus might genuinely feel victimized by what I'd done. But another part of me knew that she was right. Marcus wasn't the victim here. Marcus was the perpetrator, and he was now trying to flip the script by making me look like the villain. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now we investigate," Victoria said. "And then we make a determination. But I'll tell you this. If Marcus continues to make these kinds of accusations without evidence, and if he continues to create a hostile work environment for himself and others by bringing personal family drama into the workplace, we may have to have a conversation with him about whether this job is a good fit." After we hung up, I realized that I'd stumbled into something I hadn't intended. By defending myself, I'd inadvertently put Marcus's job in jeopardy, and that realization made me feel something complicated. Vindication, maybe, but also guilt and regret, and a kind of sadness that I couldn't quite articulate. Because what I'd wanted was for Marcus to understand me. What I'd wanted was for him to see that I wasn't the person he'd accused me of being. What I'd wanted was to have a real conversation with my son about his concerns and my values and the space between them. But instead, what I'd gotten was a formal complaint and an HR investigation and the knowledge that my son was now potentially facing consequences at his job because of accusations he'd made about me. I called Catherine again. "I think I've made things worse," I told her, and I explained what had happened with HR and the formal complaint. "No," Catherine said firmly. "You didn't make things worse. Marcus made things worse. You just responded to what he did. There's a difference." "But now his job might be in jeopardy," I said. "Because of his own actions," Catherine said. "Not because of yours." "Samili, listen to me. Your son made accusations about you to his coworkers. That's what started this. You didn't start this. You didn't ask for this. You just responded when you were accused, and now he's trying to make you feel guilty for responding? That's gaslighting. That's manipulation. And I'm not going to let you accept that. But I was accepting it. I could feel myself accepting it, even as Catherine was telling me not to. Because the truth was that I loved my son. And loving him meant that his pain, even pain he'd created for himself, was my pain too. And I didn't know how to separate myself from that. I didn't know how to say, this is his responsibility, not mine, and actually mean it. The HR investigation took 6 weeks. During those 6 weeks, I didn't hear from Marcus. I didn't reach out to him. I just waited, suspended in a kind of limbo where I was simultaneously the victim and the villain, depending on whose perspective you adopted. I spent those 6 weeks doing what I should have done from the beginning. I spent time with the people who loved me. I had long conversations with Catherine about identity and activism and the ways that progressive causes can become corrupted by ego and performance. I had coffee with Derek, and I learned about his life and his relationship and his work. I attended a community organizing meeting and volunteered for a voter registration drive. I did the work that I'd always done, not because I was trying to prove anything to anyone, but because it was the work I believed in. And slowly, something shifted inside me. The shame I'd been carrying started to dissipate. The guilt I'd been feeling started to transform into something else. Understanding, maybe. Or acceptance. Or both. I started to understand that Marcus's accusation said more about him than it said about me. It said that he was struggling with his own identity. It said that he was trying to establish himself as morally superior to his parents. It said that he was using progressive language as a weapon instead of as a tool for actual change. And yes, those things were concerning, but they weren't my responsibility to fix. They were his. When Victoria Chen called me with the results of the investigation, I was almost calm. "We've completed our review," she said. "And we've determined that your email to HR and your message to Derek do not constitute harassment or interference. You were providing context about your own background, and you were reaching out to apologize for a misunderstanding. Both of those things are reasonable and appropriate. However, we have determined that Marcus's behavior, specifically his public allegations about your character and his subsequent formal complaint, does constitute a pattern of creating a hostile work environment. We're going to be having a conversation with him about his behavior and the expectations we have for how employees conduct themselves in the workplace." "What does that mean?" I asked, though I could guess. "It means he's on a performance improvement plan," Victoria said. "It means he has 3 months to demonstrate that he can work in this environment without bringing personal drama into the workplace. It means he needs to understand that making broad character allegations about family members to colleagues is not appropriate workplace behavior. And it means that if he continues this pattern, we may have to let him go." I should have felt triumphant. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt tired. I felt sad. I felt like I'd won a battle but lost something much more important in the process. "I don't want him to lose his job," I said to Victoria. "I understand," she said. "And I don't think he will, as long as he's willing to change his behavior. But Samili, I want you to know something. Your son is intelligent and capable, but he has a tendency to see the world in very black and white terms. He has a tendency to make people into villains if they don't align perfectly with his worldview. That's not a healthy way to move through the world. I hope he figures that out." After we hung up, I sat with those words for a long time. Because Victoria was right. Marcus did see the world in black and white terms. And he had made me into a villain because I didn't align perfectly with his worldview. And that was his issue to work through, not mine. But that didn't mean I could just stop being his mother. That didn't mean I could just write him off. That didn't mean I could stop loving him even when he was being unfair to me. I didn't reach out to Marcus after the HR investigation concluded. I didn't call him or email him or send him a message through social media. I just waited because I'd learned something important during those 6 weeks. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply exist in your own truth and let other people decide whether they want to be part of that truth or not. 2 months after the investigation concluded, Marcus called me. His voice was different on the phone, quieter, less certain, like the confidence he'd been carrying had cracked somewhere along the way. "Hi, Mom," he said, and just those 2 words contained an apology and a plea for forgiveness and an acknowledgement that something had changed. "Hi, sweetheart," I said, and I kept my voice neutral. Not cold, but not warm either. Just honest. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I've been thinking about what happened, and I think I made a mistake. I think I took something small and turned it into something big because I needed to prove something to myself and to my coworkers, and I used you to do that. I made you into the villain in a story that was really about my own insecurities." I listened to him speak, and I could hear the genuine remorse in his voice. But I also heard something else. I heard the language of therapy. I heard the language of someone who'd been told by a professional that his behavior was problematic and needed to change. And while I was glad that he'd come to some kind of understanding, I also knew that this understanding had come not from his own moral reckoning, but from external pressure. "I appreciate that," I said carefully. "But I need you to understand something. What you did hurt me. Not because I'm ashamed of who I am or what I believe in, but because you're my son, and you took my love for you, and you used it against me. You created a narrative about me that had nothing to do with who I actually am, and you broadcast that narrative to people at your job. And then you tried to make me feel guilty for defending myself." "I know," he said, and his voice cracked slightly. "I know, and I'm sorry. I'm really sorry." "I believe you," I said. "But I need you to understand that this is going to take time to repair. I'm not going to just forget about it and pretend it didn't happen. Because it did happen, and it changed things between us." "I understand," he said. "I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." "I don't think it's about doing things," I said. "I think it's about you understanding why you did what you did and making sure you don't do it again. Not just to me, but to anyone. I think it's about you understanding that people are complex and flawed and trying their best. I think it's about you understanding that just because someone makes a mistake doesn't mean they're fundamentally a bad person." We talked for another hour. We didn't resolve everything. We didn't magically repair the damage that had been done. But we started a conversation, and that conversation was the beginning of something. Not forgiveness, exactly, but understanding. And understanding was what we both needed. It's been a 1.5 years since that phone call. Marcus and I have rebuilt our relationship, but it's different now. It's more cautious. There's a layer of awareness between us that wasn't there before. He knows that I won't accept his accusations without question. I know that he's capable of weaponizing his progressive values against people he loves, and we've both had to sit with that knowledge and figure out how to move forward anyway. He's been in therapy. He's worked on understanding his need to position himself as morally superior to his parents. He's learned to distinguish between genuine activism and performative activism. He's been kinder to his coworkers. He's been more thoughtful about the accusations he makes and the narratives he constructs. He's been trying, and I've been trying too. I've been more careful about my language. I've been more thoughtful about my assumptions. I've been more willing to admit when I'm wrong and to learn from people whose experiences are different from mine. I've been more honest about the ways that I, too, can perpetuate systems of oppression without even realizing it. But the most important thing I've learned is this: being accused of something you didn't do doesn't make you guilty. Standing up for yourself doesn't make you a bad person. And loving someone who's hurt you doesn't mean you have to accept their version of reality. I spent years marching for justice. I spent years fighting for the rights of people who were marginalized and oppressed. And I did that work because I believed that everyone deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. But I also learned, through my experience with Marcus, that dignity and respect have to go both ways. They have to apply to me as much as they apply to anyone else. And if I'm not willing to stand up for my own dignity when it's being attacked, then how can I expect anyone else to stand up for theirs? Marcus and I have dinner together most weeks now. We talk about his work and my volunteer activities. We talk about the news and politics and the state of the world. We don't always agree. We probably never will, but we listen to each other. We try to understand each other's perspectives. We treat each other with the respect that I've been fighting for my entire life, and that's enough. It's not perfect. It's not the relationship we had before, but it's real. It's honest. It's built on something solid instead of on the illusion that I'm the perfect progressive mother and he's the perfect progressive son. We're both flawed. We're both trying. We're both doing the best we can. And that's what justice really looks like. Not perfection. Not the absence of mistakes. But the willingness to acknowledge when we've done wrong and the commitment to do better. The willingness to listen to people we love, even when they're saying things that hurt us. The willingness to stand in our own truth, while also making space for other people's truths. That's what I've learned. That's what this whole painful, awful, illuminating experience has taught me. And I wouldn't trade that knowledge for anything. If you've ever been accused of something you didn't do, or if you've ever had to stand up for yourself against someone you love, I want you to know that you're not alone. And I want you to know that standing up for yourself isn't selfish or wrong. It's necessary. It's human. It's what we all deserve. If you want more stories like this, stick around.